Okay, now we'll spend some time working through an example of a general data analysis pipeline in MATLAB. So if you remember from a few videos back, we started with this general pipeline, these 9 steps, as a way to just explain the things you might likely do when you're analyzing the data that we consider in rehabilitation science. So today in this video, we're going to focus on knowing your data and showing an example of what you might do if you're given a set of data to make sure that you know what you're getting into and what you have before you start working through your analysis. So we reviewed 6 steps of knowing your data, and these are not necessarily exhaustive, but should cover most of your bases. We'll talk about how you want to make sure to understand how your data were collected. This has to do with details related to the protocol and the hardware. Then thinking about the frequency at which the data were recorded. So what's the time between measurements? So this could be on the order of milliseconds if we're thinking of EMG, or maybe on the order of days, weeks, or months if you're thinking about a clinical trial or intervention study. Whatever measurements you're using in your analysis, it's always nice to know what those units are for those measurements, both in terms of the raw data. So often those might be measured in millivolts, for instance, for EMG, and then how those raw measurements are converted to some unit of measure of interest. Ideally, you also have some information about the accuracy and reliability of your measurements, and this is largely related to the hardware you use and the protocol in place for recording your data. Once you have your data, they'll be stored in some format, so you want to make sure that you understand that format. Its interoperability, so does that, if I have a map file, can I look at that in Excel and vice versa, right? So we'll show some examples of different formats, different data formats that we can use and import into MATLAB. And then finally, we want to understand how our data files are organized. So these could be individual files for a single participant, or we can also think about how our directory of data where we store data for a full study, how those data are organized. So the data set that we'll be working with in this series of videos comes from the following publication from Scientific Data that was published back in 2019. So this is a data paper. So this Scientific Data is a journal that publishes, for instance, data descriptors. So manuscripts that extensively describe a data set, how those data were collected, and how those data are organized. So this is a data set that contains a lot of the types of data you might be interested in studying in the context of human movement. So here, this is particularly a study of walking and stair ascent and descent, where we have access to kinematic data, so marker data, kinetic data, so data from force plates, and then EMG data related to muscle activations. So there's a link to this paper in the GitHub for the course, and I advise you to take some time, maybe pause the video now and read through this paper just so that you understand how the data were collected and some of the key details. And so now what we'll do is we'll walk through some of the key steps in making sure that we understand the data that we were given. And so I'm going to do that in part by walking through the PDF version of the paper. And we'll work through these steps of data analysis in order. So I'll move back and forth from our PowerPoint to the document. So the first step that we outlined here was to make sure we understand how the data were collected. So that will be the protocol and hardware. So if we scroll through the data, I've highlighted a lot of this information that we need. If we go to our methods section, there's a very nicely detailed section describing the participants, so who those data were recorded from, some of the demographic information about those participants. And then information about the experimental procedure itself is laid out here in the experimental procedure section. So key things that you'll want to know for this data set are that each subject undergoes a static trial where the marker positions are calibrated, then several dynamic trials where they do 1 of 5 tasks. They can either walk at one or more speeds, walk on their toes, walk on their heels, ascend a pair of stairs, or descend a pair of stairs, and all of these tasks were performed barefoot. So a very concise but clear explanation of the experimental procedure. So then for each trial, there's more detail provided, for instance, about the static calibration, what markers were used. There's a nice figure describing the experimental setup. So even though we would expect this in a journal publication, this is something you might also want to include, for instance, as part of your directory when you save your own data, so that it's easy for you to hand that off to another person and they understand what you've done. We can go on and read the protocol in more detail, instructions given to participants, right? So these are things that are important related to how fast they're going to walk, as an example, and then some details about the stair ascent and descent. So that essentially summarizes the key information that we need to know about how the data were collected. There's also information about how many trials each person performed and the total number of trials we should expect for each participant. So the next thing that we might want to consider are something about the measurements. So how frequently were our data sampled? So before I get to that, I just wanted to highlight one other thing related to hardware. So here they have a section on instrumentation where they lay out the lab where the data were recorded. The setup, the camera setup for their motion capture system is outlined here. And then some level of detail about the at least brand of force platform and EMG system that were used. You could also add information about specific models of the hardware you're using and even the software that's used to collect your data. So the next point was about the frequency at which our data were collected. And we can see that that's largely highlighted here. So it looks like there are, depending potentially on when the data were collected in this lab, we can see that marker trajectories were recorded at 1 of 2 frequencies, and similarly force plate data and EMG were recorded at 1 of several frequencies. So this is something you'll want to keep in mind when analyzing the data, and not assume that there's a constant frequency for all trials and all participants. And when we look at the data more closely, we'll see how we can extract this information automatically so that we don't have to manually update it for each participant. Oops. So the next thing that we will review here are units of measure. So here we'll take a closer look at the data once we get into MATLAB to answer this. And so before we do that, one of the things that I want to highlight here is how we can access this data. All right, so we started here in the scientific data website through Nature. I downloaded the PDF that we were just reviewing, but the actual data are linked through the web version of the manuscript. So in this case, we can go to the references. I've already done this, but we can go to reference 34, and this is a link to a website called Figshare, which is just one repository that people use to share data and figures related to their work. So if I select this link, this will take me to the Figshare website, and this is a portion of that website that's linked to the publisher Springer and their Nature set of journals. So here, now we have a detailed description of the data. So this is less about the protocol now and more about the actual files that we would want to access. So let's look through this database for a moment. So if we scroll down here, we see a little bit of information related to keywords about the type of data that we're accessing. And then there are 54 files below that constitute the data and some of the code that we might want to review. So for now, the first thing that we're going to do is download the data for all of the participants. So in this, on this site, we have some options. We can download files individually here, or if we scroll all the way, I believe this is at the end of the page. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. So here you'll want to download two files to begin with. The first is this all subjects file. So this is a data set that contains the data, self-explanatory, for all of the participants. You'll also want to download this demographics and anthropometrics file as well. So those are the main two files we'll be working with through these demos. All right, so we'll take some time once we get into MATLAB to really start to think about the units of our data, because it's a little bit easier once we can start to plot things. Okay, so the next point here was about the accuracy and reliability of the measurements. So this is one of the things I really like about this paper, is that they have a description, a dedicated section in the paper about how they evaluate reliability. So if we go back to our manuscript, scroll past experimental procedure, past data elaboration, past the data records. Yeah, so in technical validation, this is where they now talk about how they try to maintain high quality of their data. So this refers to things like how the cameras and force platforms were calibrated, the strategy used to label the markers, information about the quality of the marker trajectory, so how many frames were lost, and so on. And then they even have a section about the reliability of the protocol that they used in this study. So this would they can reference here previous studies that have demonstrated reliability of this protocol, and they are providing us with assessments of reliability that are quantitative with respect to errors in different measures. So this is a really useful set of information to know about whatever study you're doing. If you're not familiar with doing reliability studies, key things that you might want to assess, for instance, if you're placing markers on someone, imagine you take 5 people, bring them into the lab, place your marker set, evaluate some measure of their self-selected walking speed, peak knee flexion, for example. You could do that on one day, and then have those same 5 people come back a week later, replace the markers again, and then evaluate the same measure. So the consistency of that measure from one day to the next reflects in part the reliability of you as the experimenter in placing those markers. So again, more detail here that you should read and think through as you work through this manuscript. The 5th point has to do with the format in which the data are stored, and here this is described again in the manuscript. So now if we scroll back up, we see there's a section on data records. So they refer to the location where the data are stored. We just saw the Figshare website. And then they talk about the different files that correspond to each subject, and the fact that these files are in MATLAB format. The last point on our PowerPoint slide about understanding our data had to do with understanding how the data are organized. And so here, that organization structure is described in the text, where there is a mat file. That mat file contains a structure, which we'll talk about in the next video. And then within that structure, we have all of the following information. So there's demographic information, information related to the measurements themselves, the sampling rate, several different measures, kinematic, kinetic, EMG, and then some data that were processed from those raw measurements. So as an example, you can take raw marker data and then use that data to compute joint angles. And so if you take joint angles and your ground reaction forces, you can use that data to compute joint moments and power. So this is just a nice description of the details of the data files that are provided for this paper. All right, so next what we're going to do is to go to MATLAB and start to get a feel for the data. So we'll do some exploratory analysis, if you will, and we'll walk through some different functions that help us along the way. And if you look at the GitHub, one of the things that we'll be doing as we write code, we'll reference online resources that may help you understand the functions or tools that we're using as we work through our data analysis pipeline.